Karoline Leavitt gives up first-class seat for veteran. Then the unbelievable happens. The moment Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the plane, she felt relief wash over her. It had been a long day of briefings, press calls, and the never-ending buzz of Washington, D.C. politics. She wasn't just the youngest White House press secretary, she was in the trenches battling the media every single day. But today she was heading home, a short flight to Manchester, New Hampshire, where for a few days she could be just Karoline, the girl who grew up in a small town scooping ice cream at her family shop. She adjusted the strap of her carry-on and moved swiftly through the aisle, the scent of fresh coffee mixed with a faint chemical tang of airplane upholstery. It was a full flight, every row packed, passengers already shifting in their seats, adjusting their armrest, flipping through in-flight magazines. First class wasn't a luxury for her, it was just practicality as part of the White House team she traveled. Constantly, this seat with its extra space and quiet was a small reprieve before another chaotic week. She reached her row and settled in, placing her bag underneath the seat in front of her, and then she saw him, a man maybe in his late 80s, walking in slowly down the aisle with a steady but deliberate pace. His frail frame was draped in an old, well-worn jacket, and on his head sat a cap that read World War II veteran, the kind of cap you didn't just buy in a store, one that meant something, a quiet symbol of sacrifice. Karoline watched as he carefully maneuvered his way down the narrow space, gripping each seat for support. The passengers around him barely seemed to notice. Some were too engrossed in their phones, others were impatiently waiting for the boarding process to end. But Karoline saw something else: exhaustion, not just physical, but deep, like a man who had carried more than his share of weight in life. The flight attendant directed him toward a seat 26B deep in the middle of economy. Karoline glanced at the tight row, the lack of legroom, the long journey ahead. Something didn't sit right. She stood. "Sir," she said, stepping into the aisle. The old man looked up, slightly startled, his eyes clouded with age, but sharp with wisdom met hers. "Yes." She hesitated for only a second, then gestured toward a seat. "I'd be honored if you take my spot up here." A beat of silence stretched between them. The veteran blinked, surprised. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly, please," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've already done so much for this country. Let me do this for you." The flight attendant, overhearing the exchange, stepped in. "That's very kind of you, Miss Leavitt." Other passengers had started to take notice. A murmur passed through the cabin. A businessman 2 rows back paused from checking his emails. A young woman with headphones pulled them down, and a couple in their 40s exchanged knowing glances. The veteran let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Well, if you insist, but only if you let me buy you a coffee when we land." Karoline smiled. "Deal." The flight attendant helped the man into the first-class seat, while Karoline gathered her bag. As she made her way to the back, she could feel eyes following her. She didn't do it for attention, she didn't do it for a story, it just felt right. But as she slipped into 26B, sandwiched between 2 passengers, she had no idea that what she had just set in motion would become a national story, and that before the flight even landed. Something unbelievable was about to happen. But then, just as she was settling in, the man next to her whispered something that sent a cold shock through her veins. Karoline barely had time to adjust to her new seat when the man beside her, a middle-aged passenger in a wrinkled button-down, leaned in slightly. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "You know who that is, right?" She turned to him, caught off guard. "Excuse me." He nodded toward first class, where the veteran was now settling into her former seat, adjusting the recline with slow, deliberate movements. His hands, nodded with age, gripped the armrest as if they carried more than just the weight of his body. "That guy," the man muttered. "That's not just any veteran, that's Joseph Monroe." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it made her stomach tighten. "I don't." "Who is he?" she asked. The man huffed a quiet laugh. "Of course you wouldn't know, they don't talk about guys like him much anymore." Karoline's brow furrowed. Something about the way he said guys like him felt loaded, not in a malicious way, but like he knew something she didn't. "He was in the 82nd Airborne during World War II," the man continued, "paratrooper. But after the war, let's just say, he got caught up in things." A prickle of unease crept along the back of Karoline's neck. "What kind of things?" The man's eyes flicked around, as if making sure no one was eavesdropping. "CIA, Black Ops, the kind of missions that don't officially exist." Then back in the 70s he disappeared, just vanished. "Some people think he was involved in something big, something the government wanted buried." Karoline's instinct was to dismiss it as another conspiracy theory. She had spent enough time in Washington to recognize the way people twisted half-truths into dramatic stories, but something about this man's tone, the certainty in it, gave her pause. And then, as if on cue, Joseph Monroe turned his head and looked straight at her. She felt it before she saw it, that subtle, heavy awareness of being watched. His gaze wasn't unkind, but it was piercing, studying her as if he knew exactly what she was hearing. A slow, deliberate not of gratitude, not of acknowledgement, something else. Karoline swallowed. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the way people looked at her, a couple of whispers, a few glances in her direction. Then the flight attendant returned, smiling warmly as she handed Monroe a drink, but her eyes flicked to Karoline for just a second too long, and then came the man in 24A. He was seated 2 rows ahead, but Karoline noticed him when he twisted slightly in his seat, just enough to glance back toward first class, just enough to glance at Monroe. Unlike the others, he wasn't whispering to a seatmate or typing on his phone. He was watching, focused, too focused. She felt her stomach tighten again. Was this just paranoia? Was she reading too much into a harmless situation? The overhead speakers crackled, and the captain's voice came through, announcing their cruising altitude and estimated arrival time. Karoline Forced herself to relax. She had been in politics long enough to know how easy it was for people to get swept up in rumors, and yet the way Monroe had looked at her, the way the man beside her had spoken his name, the way 24A kept glancing back, just slightly, just enough to track Monroe's movements, something was off, and it wasn't just about an old man getting an upgrade to first class. But before she could think any further, the pilot's voice came over the intercom again, this time with an edge of concern. The static from the intercom crackled for a second too long before the pilot spoke again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing an unexpected systems check from air traffic control. Nothing to be concerned about, but we'll be in a holding pattern for the next 20 minutes. Flight attendants, please remain in position. Karoline sat up straighter. She had taken enough flights to know that holding patterns weren't unusual. But something about the way the announcement was phrased felt off. The man beside her let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah, that's not normal. She turned to him. What do you mean? He nodded toward the window where mid-flight, no turbulence, no airspace congestion, a system check from air traffic control at this altitude. That's just vague enough to mean nothing and everything. Karoline clenched her jaw. Maybe she was overthinking things, maybe this was just a weird coincidence, but her gut was telling her otherwise. And then from first class, Joseph Monroe turned his head again, this time locking eyes with her intentionally enough. Karoline unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The man next to her glanced up surprised. Where are you going to get some answers? She said. She walked carefully up the aisle, ignoring the glances from other passengers. Her heartbeat picked up as she reached Monroe's row. He saw her coming and without hesitation gestured for her to take the empty seat beside him. For a long moment neither of them spoke, then he let out a slow breath and said, you didn't have to give up your seat for me. Karoline shook her head. It was the right thing to do. Monroe studied her up close. She could see the deep lines in his face, not just the kind that came with age, but the kind that came from carrying too many burdens for too many years. You have no idea what you just walked into, do you? He finally asked. Her throat tightened. What does that mean? Monroe glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. Then in a voice solo she had to lean in to hear, he said, they're watching me. Her pulse jumped too. He exhaled through his nose. People who don't like old secrets resurfacing. Karoline swallowed. And you think this flight delay has something to do with you? Monroe gave a slow measured nod. I know it does. Silent stretch between them, thick and heavy. I don't get it. She admitted. You're a veteran, a war hero. Why would anyone be watching you now? Monroe's jaw tightened. Because I didn't just fight in the war, I fought after it, and the things I did. The things I know some people would rather stay buried. A prickle of unease slid down her spine. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the conversation. Miss Leavitt. Karoline turned. It was him, the man from 24A. He stood just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. I need you to come with me, he said. But before she could even process what was happening, Monroe's hands shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. Monroe's grip was firm despite his age, his fingers wrapping around Karoline's wrist with a strength that didn't match his frail frame. His eyes sharp, calculating, locked onto hers. Don't go with him, he muttered under his breath. Karoline's stomach twisted. The man from 24A stood a few feet away, waiting, his face unreadable. He wasn't a flight attendant, he wasn't wearing an airline badge. He looked official, but official in a way she couldn't quite place. Miss Leavitt, he repeated, his voice calm but insistent. I need you to come with me. The entire first class cabin was watching now. The flight attendant standing near the galley hesitated before stepping forward. Sir, I need to ask why you're. The man didn't even look at her. He pulled something from his pocket, a badge, but not TSA, not Airport Security, Federal Aviation Administration. This is a matter of security, he said, eyes flicking to Monroe for the briefest second before returning to Karoline. Come with me, please. Her breath caught. FAA? What the hell did the FAA need with her? She glanced down at Monroe, who still hadn't let go of her wrist. His expression darkened. They're not FAA, he whispered. I've seen this before. They want something. Karoline didn't know what to believe, but something about this felt wrong. Her instinct told her to play along, at least until she understood what was happening. Slowly she pried Monroe's fingers from her wrist and stood. The flight attendant still looked uneasy, but she stepped back as Karoline followed the man toward the front of the plane. Every passenger was watching now. Some whispered, others just stared wide-eyed as she was led through the curtain separating first class from the cockpit area. The man stopped near the flight attendant's jump seat, where another man, a second official-looking figure, was waiting. Karoline Leavitt, the second man, said, scanning her face, do you have any knowledge of an individual on this flight named Joseph Monroe? Her pulse pounded. The first man cut in. We believe he is in possession of classified material. Something that he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Something that could compromise national security. Karoline's skin went cold. What she breathed. The second man's voice lowered. Miss Leavitt, we need you to remain calm. We believe he boarded this flight with documents that were never meant to see the light of day. She could barely process what they were saying. So why are you talking to me? The first man gave her a long look. Because he trusts you. Her stomach twisted. They weren't wrong. Monroe had barely said anything to anyone else. He had locked eyes with her, pulled her into his confidence. He had chosen her, and now these men, whoever they really were, wanted her to help them. I don't know anything, she said carefully. I gave him my seat. That's it. The second man studied her like he was trying to determine whether she was lying. The plane jolted slightly with a bit of turbulence, and for a moment all three of them swayed. The first man's radio crackled, a voice on the other end, urgent but muffled. Then suddenly his posture changed. He stiffened, pressing a hand to his earpiece. The color drained from his face. The second man did the same. They exchanged a brief look. Something had changed. Then, without another word, they both turned and hurried toward the cockpit. Karoline stood there, hard hammering. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear. This flight was no longer just a routine trip home. But just as she turned back toward the cabin, the entire plane suddenly lurched so violently that passengers screamed. The plane dropped. Not a subtle shift. This was a gut-wrenching, stomach-lifting plunge that sent drinks flying and passengers gasping. A chorus of panicked cries filled the cabin as overhead bins rattled. Karoline instinctively grabbed onto the nearest seat, her knuckles white as she braced herself, her heart slammed against her ribs. The flight attendants scrambled for their jump seats, strapping in. The captain's voice came over the intercom, strained but controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. Karoline had been on enough flights to recognize pilot speak. This wasn't turbulence, something was wrong. She turned, trying to see where the two men from the FA had gone. The cockpit door was still closed, but there was movement behind it, fast, urgent movement, and then out of the corner of her eye she saw Monroe. The old veteran hadn't moved. He sat completely still in first class, hands resting on the armrest, staring straight ahead as if this wasn't happening. Her pulse hammered as she made her way back toward him, gripping the headrest of seats for balance. A flight attendant called after her, "Miss, please remain seated," but she ignored it. She reached Monroe's row and leaned in. "What the hell is happening?" she whispered. He didn't answer right away, just turned his head slowly, his gaze steady. Then in a voice barely above a whisper he said, "It's not turbulence, it's them." Karoline's stomach twisted. "Who?" she demanded. Monroe exhaled. "The ones who don't want me to land." Her hands clenched the seat in front of her. "Listen to me," Monroe said, his voice suddenly more urgent. "There's something in my bag, something they don't want you to see." Karoline blinked. What? He reached down, slow and deliberate, and tapped the black carry-on tucked beneath his seat. "You need to take it," he said. "No matter what happens." Every nerve in her body screamed that this was insane, that she should go back to her seat, that she should let whoever those men were deal with it. But the look in Monroe's eyes stopped her. It was the look of a man who knew his time was running out. Karoline hesitated, glancing around. The passengers were still tense, some gripping their armrest, others murmuring prayers under their breath. The FA agents hadn't returned. The cockpit was still locked. Slowly she reached down and grabbed the bag. It was heavier than she expected. On my Manhattan demerit. She unzipped it just enough to see inside and felt her blood turn to ice. Inside, tucked beneath a layer of neatly folded clothes, was a thick sealed envelope, not just any envelope, one marked with the official insignia of the United States government. Her breath caught. This wasn't just some old war memento, this was classified, and she was holding it. She zipped the bag back up, pulse pounding, and looked up at Monroe. "What is this?" she hissed. Before he could answer, the cockpit door burst open. The two FA agents stormed back into the cabin, moving straight from Monroe. "So you need to come with us." Their voices were sharp, now commanding. This wasn't a request. Passengers turned to watch, murmurs rippling through the cabin. Karoline barely breathed. When Roe didn't resist, he exhaled through his nose, slow and measured, before rising to his feet. Then just before stepping past her, he leaned in so close that only she could hear, "Don't trust them." Then he was gone. But just as they reached the cockpit door, the plane lurched again, this time with even more force. The lights flickered, a high-pitched alert rang through the cabin, and then the oxygen masks dropped. Something was happening to this plane, and whatever it was, Karoline knew one thing: Monroe had been right. The oxygen mask dangled, swaying slightly as the plane continued to shudder. A ripple of panic surged through the cabin, people fumbling to pull the mass over their faces, some frozen in shock, others gasping for breath. The low artificial voice of the automated safety system echoed overhead, "Please place the oxygen mask over your nose and mouth and breathe normally." But nothing about this was normal. Karoline's mind raced. The FAA agents had disappeared into the cockpit with Monroe, and now suddenly everything was spiraling out of control. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the oxygen mask, pulling it over her face. The cool rush of oxygen flooded her lungs, but it did little to slow the pounding of her heart. She needed to think. The bag, Monroe had given it to her for a reason. She glanced down at it, still wedged between her feet. If the FA agents, or whoever they really were, had known Monroe had classified documents, why hadn't they checked his bag? Why had they taken him, but left behind whatever was they were so desperate to keep hidden? Because they didn't think he'd pass it off to someone else. They hadn't expected her. A sudden thud made her flinch. The cockpit door, it had locked behind the agents in Monroe. Karoline's breath caught. Something was happening in there, something bad. A flight attendant, her eyes wide with fear, rushed up the aisle toward the cockpit. "Captain," she called, knocking on the door. "Captain, what's going on?" Silence, and the attendants exchanged nervous glances. Then another job, not turbulence, not whether something was wrong with the plane. A man across the aisle gripped his armrest, his knuckles white. "Are we going down?" he muttered, voice shaky. Karoline refused to believe that. She turned back to the flight attendant. "What's going on? Do you have communication with the cockpit?" The woman shook her head. "They're not responding." Karoline's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a malfunction, this was a hijacking. Her first instinct was to stand up, to demand answers, to push past the panic and force someone to explain what was happening. But then she remembered Monroe's last words: "Don't trust them." Not just the agents, anyone. Her eyes flicked back to the bag. If Monroe had risked everything to get this to her, if those men had taken him without checking what he was carrying, that meant this was the most important thing on the plane right now. And if they realized she had it, she was next. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The other passengers were still panicking, still fumbling with their oxygen masks, their voices rising in fearful murmurs. She needed time, she needed a plan. Carefully, quietly, she reached down and pulled Monroe's bag onto her lap. The zipper was stiff, the fabric slightly worn inside. She felt the sealed envelope, the one with the official government insignia. She hesitated. Opening something like this was beyond dangerous. If she was caught with classified documents, it wouldn't just be the agent she had to worry about, it would be the government itself. But what if this was bigger than that? What if Monroe had risked everything because what was in this bag couldn't stay hidden anymore? Her fingers brushed against the envelope, her breath hitched. There was something else in there, something metal, small, a flash drive. Karoline's mind spun. The envelope contained secrets on paper, But the drive was something else entirely. She didn't have time to think. She shoved the bag back under her seat. Just as the cockpit door suddenly unlocked, the first agent stepped out alone. Monroe was gone, and his face, normally so composed, was pale. His eyes landed on Karoline and he started walking toward her. She had seconds to decide what to do next, but before he could reach her, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came back on. Only this time something about it sounded wrong. The intercom crackled again, the captain's voice coming through, but something was off. His tone was too slow, too measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." A pause. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Remain calm. Further instructions will be provided shortly." The agent was still walking toward Karoline. His steps were deliberate, his expression unreadable. Karoline's mind raced. The cockpit door had been locked. The pilot and co-pilot hadn't responded to the flight attendants, and now suddenly the captain was back on the intercom, sounding like he was being forced to say something. The pieces snapped together. He wasn't the one speaking freely. Someone else was controlling him, and Monroe, he was gone. Karoline swallowed hard, fighting to keep her face neutral as the agent reached her row. He crouched slightly, his voice just loud enough for her to hear over the hum of panic and whispers in the cabin. "I need you to come with me." She shook her head. "I don't think so." His jaw tightened, but he didn't force it. Instead, he lowered his voice further. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Her pulse pounded. He knew Monroe had said don't trust them. That meant she had one option left. She leaned in slightly, dropping her voice. "If I go with you, the whole plane will know something's wrong." The agent didn't move. She pushed further. "You don't want that. You want quiet, you want control, but if you drag me out of this seat, you won't have that anymore." For the first time something flickered behind his eyes. Doubt. The agent straightened, glancing around at the cabin. Passengers were already watching, fear evident in their eyes. The flight attendants were murmuring to each other, uncertain, but on the edge of stepping in, and Karoline saw it. He wasn't in charge, not really. Whoever was behind this, whoever had taken Monroe, whoever had made the captain deliver that message, this agent was just a pawn. So she did something that went against every dairy instinct. She relaxed, or at least she pretended to. She exhaled, nodding slightly. "I don't want trouble," she murmured. "I just want to land safely." It was a gamble, a big one, because if she made him think she wasn't a threat, he might back off. The agent studied her for a long moment, then to her shock, he gave the smallest nod and walked away. Karoline barely had time to process what had just happened before the intercom crackled again. The real captain's voice came through, not the one from earlier. This one was raw, strained, terrified. "This is your captain." A heavy pause, then through gritted teeth, "Do not land this plane." The intercom cut out. A collective gas rippled through the cabin. Karoline's blood ran cold. The real captain had just given a direct message, and whoever had been controlling the last announcement, they weren't in charge anymore. The plane jolted slightly, as if fighting against an external force, against whatever had been planned, and that's when Karoline knew Monroe had been right. Someone had wanted him gone. Someone had wanted this plane redirected, and she was sitting on the only proof left. She reached down, gripping Monroe's bag tightly. She didn't know who she could trust. She didn't know where this plane was about to land, but she did know one thing: whatever was on that flash drive, it was enough to get a man taken mid-flight, and that meant it was worth fighting for. Some truths aren't meant to stay buried. Some secrets are dangerous to uncover. But when the moment comes, will you choose comfort, or will you choose the truth? If you found this story gripping, share your thoughts below, and remember, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness lead to the most unexpected consequences.